July 7th, 1863. 4 days after the guns fell silent at Gettysburg, a farmer named Samuel Weaver stands at the edge of his ravaged cornfield, watching Union burial details working through the morning mist. They're not burying men, they're burying horses. Thousands of them. But Samuel notices something the soldiers don't, something that makes his blood run cold. The ground is moving. Cavalry charges ended with mounts and riders piled in writhing masses. By the battle's end, the fields were carpeted with equine corpses in various states of dismemberment, their intestines steaming in the July heat, their blood turning the creeks rust-colored. But the real horror wouldn't begin until after the fighting stopped. The Union Army faced a logistical nightmare. They had barely enough men and supplies to bury their own dead. Confederate corpses would wait days or weeks, and the horses, the thousands upon thousands of dead and dying horses, represented a public health catastrophe. In the summer heat, decomposition began within hours. The smell became unbearable. Diseases festered. The Army needed a solution. Fast, cheap, efficient. They found one. But efficiency, as Samuel Weaver would discover, sometimes comes at a terrible cost. Incident 1, the first burial detail. July 5, 1863. Captain William Thompson of the 12th Pennsylvania Reserves receives his orders on the morning of July 5th. His company, exhausted men who've been fighting for 3 straight days, are to begin clearing horse carcasses from the southern battlefield sector. Thompson's diary, preserved in the Adams County Historical Society, describes his initial reaction. The men protested mightily. They had not joined to become gravediggers for beasts, but orders are orders, and we are all too tired to do more than grumble. The detail begins at dawn. They start near the wheat field, where Union cavalry had clashed with Confederate infantry. Thompson counts 67 horse carcasses in a single acre. They're bloated from the heat, legs rigid, eyes clouded white. The smell is described in multiple accounts as beyond description and sufficient to bring strong men to vomiting. But here's where the first, disturbing detail emerges. Private James Caldwell, age 19, from Philadelphia, reports that not all the horses are dead. "We found them breathing still," he writes in a letter to his mother dated July 8th. "Wounded in ways that offered no hope of recovery, legs shattered or guts torn open, but breathing nonetheless. Sergeant McCready said to leave them where they lay, said they'd be dead before we finished digging." The burial protocol was brutally simple. Dig trenches 6 feet deep and as long as necessary. Use ropes and teams of surviving horses to drag the carcasses to the trench. Push them in, cover them with soil, move to the next location. Thompson's detail digs their first trench behind the Weaver property, a depression in the earth 200 yards long, 12 feet wide, 6 feet deep. They work through the day, and by evening they've dragged 180 horse carcasses into the pit. "The living ones screamed when we moved them," Private Caldwell writes. "I shall hear it in my dreams until I die." But they don't stop work. They're soldiers following orders. By nightfall, 6 feet of Pennsylvania soil covers the trench. The job is done, except it isn't. Incident 2, the night sounds. July 5th, 6th, 1863, Samuel Weaver can't sleep. His farmhouse, located just 50 yards from the burial trench, seems to vibrate with sound. At first he thinks it's his imagination. Trauma from watching 3 days of battle destroy his land. His corn crop is ruined, trampled by thousands of men and animals. His barn has been converted into a field hospital where surgeons amputated limbs and stacked them outside like cordwood. But Elizabeth hears it too, so do the children. A thumping, Samuel later testifies to a military inquiry board, like someone beating a drum underground, and sounds like crying, animal crying but wrong somehow, too desperate, too aware. At 2:00 a.m., Samuel walks out to the burial trench. The moon is 3/4 full, providing enough light to see, and what he sees makes him question his sanity. The ground is moving, not uniformly, in sections. Areas of the trench, perhaps 10 or 15 feet long, rise several inches, then foul. Then rise again. In the moonlight he can see cracks forming in the loose soil, gaps that seem to exhale warm air that smells of blood and panic. Samuel does what any reasonable person would do. He tells himself it's settling. It's gases from decomposition. It's the earth compacting, under its own weight. He goes back inside. He doesn't sleep. The next morning, July 6th, Captain Thompson's detail returns to dig another trench 200 yards north of the first. They will dig 4 more trenches over the next 3 days, burying an estimated 800 horses in the immediate area around the Weaver farm. But Thompson notices something that troubles him. The first trench, the one they filled just yesterday, has changed. The earth appeared disturbed, he writes, as though something beneath had attempted to burrow upward. Several of my men commented on it. We agreed not to investigate. We had 4 more days of this devil's work ahead of us. Incident 3, The Witness. July 7th, 1863. Martha Jensen is 12 years old. She lives with her parents on a farm adjacent to the Weavers. Unlike Samuel, Martha doesn't rationalize what she sees. On the morning of July 7th, while her parents are in town helping to establish emergency hospitals, Martha walks to the burial trenches. Children are morbidly curious, and Martha is no exception. She wants to see where they buried the war horses. What she witnesses will haunt her for the rest of her life. In testimony given 60 years later, in 1923, to a researcher documenting Gettysburg civilian experiences, Martha describes it with the clarity of trauma that never fades. The ground was breathing. I know how that sounds, but I was 12, not stupid, and I knew what I saw. Patches of earth rose and fell like a chest drawing breath, and from cracks in the soil came sounds, whinnying, screaming, the sound a horse makes when it's terrified beyond reason, and scraping, like hooves on wood, only the wood was earth. Martha runs home. She tells her parents. They don't believe her. They assume she's traumatized by the battle, by the bodies, by the upheaval of having war arrive on her doorstep. They keep her inside for the next week. But Martha isn't the only witness. Incident 4, The Soldier's Confession, July 9, 1863. Private Caldwell cannot live with what he's done. On July 9th, he approaches his regimental chaplain, Father Michael Donovan, and makes a confession that Donovan records in his personal journal. The boy was weeping, Donovan writes. He told me that on July 5th, his detail had buried horses that were still alive, not dying, alive, wounded certainly, some grievously so, but conscious and aware. He said Sergeant McCready ordered them to proceed anyway, said the Army couldn't spare men to euthanize every injured horse individually, said it was more merciful to bury them quickly than let them suffer for days in the heat. Caldwell tells Donovan something else, something that makes the chaplain physically ill. He said that as they shoveled earth onto the pile of horses, he saw one mare, a gray cavalry mount, lift her head. She looked directly at him. He swears she looked at him with understanding, with accusation. And then the earth covered her face. Donovan counsels Caldwell, offers absolution, and promises to report this to the military authorities. But Donovan is a realist. He knows what happens to soldiers who make trouble during wartime. He knows the Army is overwhelmed, desperate, and in no mood for moral complications. He writes the report. It disappears into military bureaucracy. No investigation follows. But the sounds from the burial trenches continue. By July 10th, soldiers and civilians alike report hearing the underground chorus. Most describe it as animal sounds, whinnying, screaming, the thunder of hooves on earth. But some describe something worse. It sounded like they were trying to dig, Samuel Weaver testifies. Like hundreds of them, all digging at once, trying to claw their way back to the surface. And at night, when the wind was right, you could hear them calling to each other, the way horses do when they're separated from their herd. Except they weren't separated. They were buried together, they were dying together, and they knew it. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries that history tried to bury. The worst is yet to come. Let's discover what happens when the truth finally claws its way to the surface. July 12th, 1863, 1 week after the first horses were buried. A heavy rainstorm moves through Adams County, dumping 3 inches of water in 6 hours. The summer ground, already saturated with blood and disturbed by thousands of boots and hooves, cannot absorb the deluge. Water runs in sheets across the battlefield, pooling in shell craters and trenches, including the burial trenches. Samuel Weaver wakes at dawn on July 13th to find his farmland transformed into a nightmare landscape. The rain has caused partial collapses in 3 of the 5 burial trenches on his property, and what the collapses have revealed makes him vomit into his own corn crib. Horses are visible in the gaps, but these aren't the peaceful dead of a week ago. These are horses that have been buried alive and spent their final days trying to escape. The evidence is undeniable. Inside the trenches, wherever the soil has washed away enough to see, the horses are not lying in the peaceful repose of death. They're piled against the trench walls. Their hooves, dozens of hooves, have torn gashes in the earth walls, carving deep grooves as they tried to climb out. Some horses are positioned vertically, as though they died standing, attempting to push upward through 6 feet of soil. and some are positioned in ways that suggest they briefly succeeded. One mare, the one Samuel will never be able to forget, is visible with her head and neck protruding upward through a collapsed section of trench. Her front legs are extended above her, hooves still crusted with dirt from scratching. She made it within 18 inches of the surface before she died. 18 inches from air, from life, from escape. Her mouth is open in what can only be described as a scream frozen in death. Samuel immediately reports this to the military authorities. Captain Thompson is dispatched to investigate. What he finds corroborates Samuel's account and reveals something even worse. Thompson orders his men to carefully excavate a section of the trench. They discover that the horses weren't simply thrown in randomly. To save time and space, the burial details had organized them in layers. Wounded and dying horses on the bottom, dead horses on top, all covered with earth. The wounded ones on the bottom were conscious when the soil was shoveled onto them. Thompson's official report, preserved in the National Archives, includes this devastating passage. Upon excavation, we discovered clear evidence that numerous animals survived the initial burial. Hoofprints in the trench walls extended 4 to 5 feet above the original floor. Several animals appear to have attempted to climb atop their dead fellows to reach the surface. The positioning of the remains suggests prolonged struggle. Based on the depth of scraping marks and the extent of movement within the trench, I estimate that some animals survived for several hours following burial. One cannot avoid concluding that they died of suffocation while fully conscious and desperately attempting escape. But Thompson's report contains an even more disturbing observation. When his men excavate deeper into the trench, they find scratch marks that extend through multiple layers of horses. Some wounded animals, buried at the bottom of a pile of carcasses, had enough life left in them to try digging through the bodies above them. Dr. Samuel Steinberg, a civilian veterinarian from Philadelphia who was visiting Gettysburg to treat surviving Army horse, is brought in to examine the remains. His findings are clinical and horrifying. A horse can survive for up to 3 hours with limited air supply if it remains calm, Dr. Steinberg writes in his assessment. However, a panicked horse in a confined space will exhaust its oxygen supply more rapidly, potentially within 30 to 60 minutes. The evidence suggests these animals were conscious and panicking. The pattern of injuries, broken teeth, shattered hooves, torn muscles, indicates frenzied activity consistent with suffocation panic. Some animals appear to have bitten through their own lips and tongues in their distress. Steinberg's report includes a detail that will appear in Samuel Weaver's nightmares for the rest of his life. In several cases, we found evidence that horses had bitten into the carcasses above them, perhaps attempting to create air passages, perhaps simply in mindless panic. The brutality of their final moments cannot be overstated. The discovery becomes impossible to contain. Soldiers talk. Sion procedures at Gettysburg were conducted in accordance with military necessity and established protocols. No evidence of improper conduct has been found. This matter is closed. But for Samuel Weaver and others who witnessed what happened, the matter is far from closed. Weaver begins documenting everything. He takes measurements of the burial trenches. He collects testimony from neighbors and soldiers. He photographs the collapsed trenches where horse remains are still visible. He's not a lawyer or an investigator. He's a farmer. But he understands that if he doesn't preserve this evidence, history will forget it ever happened. By September, Weaver has accumulated testimony from 14 soldiers and 7 civilians, all describing similar experiences: wounded horses buried alive, sounds of struggle from beneath the earth, evidence of animals trying to dig their way out. He sends his documentation to the War Department. No response. He sends it to Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin. No response. He sends it to every newspaper that will listen. Most ignore him. A few publish brief mentions, but with the war still raging, the story never gains sustained attention. And then Private James Caldwell takes his own life. On October 3, 1863, Caldwell hangs himself in a barn outside Philadelphia. His suicide note, preserved by his family, reads in part, "I cannot live with what I did. I hear them every night, the horses screaming under the earth. Father Donovan told me I was forgiven, but I cannot forgive myself. I am a murderer of innocence, and I choose to face my judgment." Caldwell's death gives the story new life. Several Philadelphia newspapers publish articles about the young soldier's suicide and its connection to the Gettysburg horse burials. Public sentiment begins to shift. Letters to the editor express outrage. Citizens groups demand investigation. The Army's response is to court-martial Sergeant John McCready, the NCO who multiple soldiers had identified as ordering them to proceed with burying wounded horses. The court-martial takes place in November 1863. It is a sham from beginning to end. McCready's defense is simple: he was following orders from Captain Thompson. Thompson testifies that he was following orders from his regimental commander. The chain of responsibility extends upward until it disappears into the fog of command structure. The transcript of the court-martial, obtained years later by researchers, reveals the Army's strategy. They're not trying to determine what happened, they're trying to determine how to make the problem disappear. Key testimony is excluded. Civilian witnesses, including Samuel Weaver, are not called to testify. Father Donovan is told his testimony is not relevant to military discipline matters. On November 18, 1863, Sergeant McCready is acquitted of all charges. The court's finding states that the defendant acted in accordance with military necessity, under extreme battlefield conditions, and cannot be held responsible for conditions beyond his control. No one else is charged. No one else is investigated. The matter is officially closed. But the story continues to haunt those who witnessed it. Samuel Weaver's farm never recovers. He tells his family that he can't work land where thousands died in darkness clawing at the earth. In 1867, he sells the property at a loss and moves his family to Ohio. Martha Jensen, the 12-year-old girl who witnessed the moving earth, never marries. She becomes a schoolteacher and lives alone until her death in 1931. In interviews late in her life, she tells researchers that she still dreams about the breathing ground. Captain William Thompson survives the war and returns to his law practice in Philadelphia. His private diaries, donated to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania after his death in 1889, include this entry from July 5, 1873. Exactly 10 years after the burials, I cannot mark this anniversary without acknowledging what I have. He tried for a decade to forget. At Gettysburg, under my command, men committed an act of mass cruelty that violated every principle of decent conduct. We buried animals alive. We heard them dying beneath our feet and did nothing. I told myself it was war, that war requires hard choices, that the alternative was worse. But I know now that there is no justification. We had rifles. We had time for mercy, if we had chosen to exercise it. I did not choose mercy. I chose efficiency, and that choice has poisoned every day of the 10 years since. I suspect it will poison whatever years remain to me. Thompson's confession never becomes public during his lifetime. His family discovers it after his death and, understanding its controversial nature, keeps it private for another 50 years. The Army's official history of Gettysburg, published in 1883, makes no mention of the horse burials. The section on battlefield cleanup spans 2 paragraphs and describes it as efficiently conducted despite challenging circumstances. Dr. Samuel Steinberg, the veterinarian who examined the burial trenches, attempts to publish his findings in the American Veterinary Review in 1864. The article is rejected without explanation. He tries again in 1868, again rejected. His report doesn't see publication until 1901, in a small academic journal with limited circulation. By then, most of the witnesses are dead. The story has become a dark legend whispered among Civil War veterans but largely forgotten by the public. The burial trenches themselves remain largely undisturbed. The Weaver property changes hands multiple times over the decades. Each owner reports strange phenomena, sounds from beneath the ground, particularly during rainstorms. Animals refuse to graze in certain areas. Crops grow poorly over the old trench lines. In 1903, during construction of a barn on what was once Weaver land, workers uncover horse bones. The construction is halted briefly, then continues. The bones are reburied on site. No investigation follows. The final bitter irony comes in 1938, during the 75th anniversary celebration of the Battle of Gettysburg. Veterans from both sides gather to commemorate the battle and reconcile. Thousands attend. Newspapers across the nation cover the event. Not one article mentions the horses. The Gettysburg horse burials represent more than a single incident of wartime cruelty. They reveal uncomfortable truths about how societies prioritize suffering, and how easily atrocity can be rationalized when committed against beings deemed less important than humans. In the immediate aftermath, the incident sparked conversations about military protocols for handling animals. The U.S. Army Veterinary Corps, established in 1916, includes provisions requiring the humane euthanasia of wounded animals, a direct response to Civil War-era abuses, including Gettysburg. But this reform came 53 years too late for the horses buried alive in Pennsylvania soil. The broader implications extend into how we remember war itself. The Battle of Gettysburg has been exhaustively documented, analyzed, and memorialized. We know the names of soldiers who fought there. We've preserved their letters, their photographs, their personal effects. We've erected monuments and markers across the battlefield, but until recently, there was no memorial for the animals who died there, no acknowledgement of their suffering, no recognition of their role in the conflict. This selective memory reveals something disturbing about human psychology. We can mourn 51,000 human casualties while forgetting 5,000 animal casualties. We can build museums and monuments while ignoring the mass graves of creatures who had no choice in their participation, no understanding of the causes they died for. The Gettysburg horse burials also exposed the dangers of prioritizing efficiency over ethics. The officers who ordered hasty burials weren't monsters. They were overworked men facing an unprecedented CRI. They made calculations. It's faster to bury everything than to check which animals are still alive. It's easier to silence complaints than to investigate them. It's safer to close ranks than to acknowledge failure. These are the same calculations that enable atrocity in every war, every crisis, every situation where normal moral constraints are suspended in the name of necessity. Similar cases emerged in the decades following Gettysburg, though most were never investigated or documented with the same detail. During World War I, military historians estimate that 8 million horses died in military service. How many were buried alive? We'll never know. The practice of mass burial without proper euthanasia was common across all armies. World War II saw some improvements, but not enough. Soviet forces, desperately fighting for survival, often abandoned wounded horses in the field. German forces, retreating across Russia, shot their own horses rather than let them fall into enemy hands, but not always before they were needed for one more supply run, one more artillery movement. The lasting impact on the Gettysburg community is harder to quantify but no less real. Families like the Weavers carried trauma that extended across generations. Children who witnessed the burials grew into adults who couldn't explain their nightmares to their own children. Land that should have been productive farmland remained blighted by memory. And beneath it all, literally, remained the horses themselves. Most of the burial trenches were never properly excavated. The bones are still there, beneath Gettysburg homes, beneath Gettysburg businesses, beneath Gettysburg schools. The earth keeps its secrets, but it keeps them in shallow graves. What this reveals about human nature is perhaps the most disturbing lesson of all. We are capable of great compassion and great cruelty, often simultaneously. The same soldiers who buried horses alive wrote tender letters home expressing love for their families. The same officers who ordered hasty burials wept over fallen comrades. We are not purely good or purely evil. We are creatures who make choices in moments of stress, and some of those choices are unforgivable. The philosopher William James, writing about moral psychology in 1890, could have been describing Gettysburg when he wrote, "We forget that every time we crush a bug, we are making a choice about which suffering matters. And the accumulation of those choices reveals who we are." In 2008, 145 years after the battle, a small granite marker was finally placed near the site of the largest burial trench on the former Weaver property. It reads simply, "In memory of the thousands of horses who served and died at Gettysburg, July 1 through 30, 1863. It doesn't mention how they died. It doesn't mention the screaming beneath the earth. It doesn't mention Private Caldwell's suicide, or Samuel Weaver's exile, or Captain Thompson's tortured conscience. But for those who know the story, the marker is enough. It acknowledges that they existed, that they suffered, that their deaths mattered. Sometimes that's all we can do for the forgotten dead. Remember that they were here and that what happened to them was wrong, and that we failed them. And sometimes, if we're honest with ourselves, admitting failure is the first step toward ensuring it never happens again. What do you think drove the officers at Gettysburg to make such a decision? Was it pure military necessity, or something darker in human nature that allows us to rationalize cruelty when it's efficient? Leave your theories in the comments below, and tell us, are there other forgotten casualties of war, human or animal, whose stories deserve to be remembered? If this video gave you chills, if it made you think about the hidden costs of conflict, then subscribe to Fear Sermon. We dig up the lost chapters of history that textbooks ignore, the dark corners that official records try to erase. Ring that notification bell so you never miss our next descent into the shadows of the past. Until next time, remember, history buries its secrets, but the earth has a way of giving them back. See you in the next video.